There's a truth good men know, rising before the sun. A current always pulls. You work hard, do right by your own, but the money just slips through your fingers, never truly yours. A cork on an ocean of bills, no control, just floating. Garrett knew that truth. 42, a factory man, clocking in before dawn. The weight of 2 kids, a mortgage, was etched around his tired eyes in the slump of his shoulders. His hands, thick from decades on the line, a testament to hard labor. Always ready for a task, mostly just profoundly weary, he looked dependable, deeply exhausted. He looked dependable, deeply exhausted. When he did speak, usually in the break room, it was with a careful economy of words, a dry wit that flickered like a weak pilot light. But mostly he just watched, his mind often elsewhere, tallying the mental ledger of impending bills. Beneath that quiet surface, a constant hum of worry vibrated, a deep-seated fear of failure, a phantom hand squeezing his throat, threatening to drag his family into the same financial quicksand he'd spent his own life navigating. He had an unwavering persistence, all right, the kind that got you out of bed every single damn morning, even when every fiber of your being screamed for a reprieve. He was practical, too, could fix almost anything with a piece of wire and some duct tape. But when it came to his own money, his own future, a paralyzing overwhelm often turned practicality into procrastination. He internalized every problem, chewed on it until it tasted like ash, rarely reaching out, convinced he had to solve it alone. And deep down, he didn't quite believe he could ever really change things, not fundamentally. Every workday began with the metallic shriek of his alarm at 5 a.m., a sound less a reminder and more a physical jolt, ripping him from the shallow reprieve of sleep. He'd swing his feet to the cold linoleum, the chill a stark companion to the pre-dawn darkness. Coffee brewed thick and black, a brief, silent ritual while Sarah, his wife, and the kids, Emily and Leo, still slept. He'd kiss Sarah's forehead, a whisper of a promise he prayed he could keep, then slip out the door of their modest, single-story house. It was a decent place once, but now the paint peeled in places, the gutters needed clearing, and there was always some creaking or leaking he couldn't quite afford the time or money to fix. It was a home, yes, but also a constant reminder of things undone, a symbol of the thin line he walked. The drive to the factory was a blur of highway lights and half-formed thoughts. Another shift, another 8-10, sometimes 12 hours of the same rhythmic clang and hum of machinery. Repetitive, mind-numbing work that bought the groceries and kept the lights on but offered little else. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent half his life doing it, his body an extension of the conveyor belt, his mind a captive of the clock. Every pull of a lever, every tighten of a bolt was a dollar earned, a dollar already mentally assigned to the endless parade of bills. Mortgage, car payment, utility, credit card, kids' school fees, groceries. It felt like his money wasn't really his to begin with. It was just a brief stopover in his account before migrating to someone else's. He saw himself as a passenger in his own financial life, carried along by currents he didn't control. The economy, his employer, the cost of living, plain old bad luck, they were all external forces, immovable mountains that dictated his every move. He often caught himself muttering under his breath about them, whoever they were, the faceless architects of his predicament. He felt trapped, a hamster on a wheel, running harder and harder just to stay in the same damn place. His money was his to control. It was a resource constantly drained, owed to others, trapped in a cycle of payment plans and interest rates that felt like quicksand. The future, with its rising costs and uncertain promises, loomed heavy, a storm cloud on the horizon, and Garrett felt like he was just standing there, waiting for the rain. His biggest fear wasn't losing what little he had, but leaving his children, Emily and Leo, with the same inherited burden, the same quiet desperation, the same feeling that life just happened to them. The blare of his phone alarm, set to a generic factory whistle sound he'd downloaded years ago, ripped Garrett from the shallow waters of sleep precisely at 5 a.m., every single weekday. He slapped it silent with a practiced move that involved more muscle memory than conscious thought, then swung his feet to the cold concrete floor, the old house groaning a familiar protest around him. He didn't bother with the light. He knew the path from the bedroom, through the narrow hallway to the bathroom and then the kitchen by heart. It was a well-worn groove, like the path his forklift made across the factory floor, a route he traveled with his eyes half closed, his mind already churning through the day's obligations before his body even caught up. A quick shower, lukewarm at best, then into the same blue work pants and gray t-shirt day in, day out. Sarah was usually already up, moving with a quiet efficiency born of years of practice, packing lunches for the kids and preparing his coffee. She'd offer a soft, tired smile, a silent acknowledgement of the grind they both faced. There wasn't much talking in the early mornings, just the clink of mugs and the rustle of lunch bags, a shared understanding that words often felt like an unnecessary weight when the real lifting hadn't even begun. By 5:30, he was out the door, the chill of the morning air hitting his face like a slap. His old pickup, a relic with more miles than sense, coughed to life, its engine a familiar symphony of minor grievances. The drive to the plant was a blur of sleepy commuters, the same faces in the same cars, heading to the same destinations. He'd park in his usual spot, walk through the gates, clock in, and then it began. The rhythmic clang and hum of machinery, the smell of grease and metal, the endless cycle of production. His job was assembly, 1,000 identical motions repeated over 8 hours, his hands moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine, his mind often drifting, a quiet observer of his own repetitive existence. He'd count the minutes, then the hours, the small victories of coffee breaks and lunch until the blessed sound of the quitting whistle. Back home, it was a different kind of work. Dinner, homework with Emily and Leo, a quick fix-it job around the house that always seemed to take longer than he anticipated. He'd open the mail, shuffling through the familiar white envelopes that screamed past due or politely reminded him of the interest growing on the balance. The credit card statement was always a gut punch, a stark reminder of those unexpected emergencies, the car repair, Emily's braces, a leaky roof that just couldn't wait. He'd stare at the numbers, the minimum payment a cruel joke, knowing that every cent he paid was just treading water, barely keeping his head above the waves. The house, their modest single story, was a constant source of quiet anxiety. It wasn't falling apart, not yet, but the paint was peeling, the gutters sagged, and there was a patch on the ceiling in the guest room that screamed of water damage from a long-forgotten storm. He had a mental list of repairs, a sprawling ledger of things he needed to fix, things he promised himself he'd get to when he had the time, when he had the money, excuses that echoed hollow in the quiet hours. But the time never seemed to arrive, and the money, well, it always seemed to be earmarked for something else, something more immediate, more pressing. What haunted Garrett wasn't just the present squeeze, but the creeping dread of the future. He'd inherited a certain weariness from his own father, a man who worked himself to the bone only to retire with little more than a handshake and a cheap watch. Garrett saw the same path stretching out before him, a treadmill leading to nowhere but exhaustion. He remembered the quiet tension in his childhood home when bills piled up, the way his mother would stretch every dollar, the unspoken sacrifices. He loved his kids more than anything, and the thought of them growing up with that same gnawing anxiety, that same feeling of always being one step behind, was a cold knot in his gut. There were dreams once, vague, half-formed things from his younger days, maybe opening his own small woodworking shop, crafting custom furniture. He had a knack for it, a steady hand and an eye for detail, but it felt like a lifetime ago, a luxury he couldn't afford to entertain. The tools he'd bought lay gathering dust in the garage, a silent accusation of what could have been, what should have been. Now, the idea of pursuing such a thing felt not just impossible, but irresponsible, a selfish indulgence when every spare penny, every waking hour, needed to be devoted to simply keeping their heads above water. He felt himself shrinking, the man he was becoming smaller than the man he'd wanted to be. He'd often internalized these feelings, pushing them down, convincing himself that complaining wouldn't help, that manning up meant just getting on with it. But deep down there was a persistent whisper, a fear that he wasn't just stuck, but that he was failing, slowly but surely, to build the life his family deserved. And the cruelest part, he didn't even know how to begin to change it. He was trapped, knew it, but couldn't see the way out, couldn't even identify the first step. Then came Emily, 12 years old, just hitting that age where everything feels like a spotlight, every imperfection magnified 100 times. It was a Tuesday afternoon, hot and muggy, the kind of heat that presses down on you even inside the house. Garrett had just come in from the garage, wiping grease from his hands, when Sarah called him to the kitchen. Emily was standing there, a little bundle of nervous energy, fiddling with the frayed strap of her backpack. She usually bounced in, full of stories about school, but today she was quiet. "Garrett," Sarah said, her voice softer than usual, a signal that something was up. "Emily needs new shoes for school." He glanced down. He hadn't really noticed before, not really. Her sneakers, once a vibrant pink and white, were now a dull, scuffed gray. The sole on one was visibly peeling away from the fabric, and there was a small, ragged hole near the big toe. They weren't just worn, they were done. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the quick, frantic mental inventory of their savings, or rather their lack thereof. New shoes, another expense, another thing to juggle, another bill to squeeze in. "Yeah, honey, we'll get you some new ones," he said, trying to sound reassuring, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "School starts back up in a few weeks, plenty of time." Emily didn't look up. She mumbled something barely audible. "It's okay, Dad, these are." "Fine, I can just wear them a little longer." That's when it hit him. Not the words, but the way she said them. The downcast eyes, the slight slump in her shoulders. It wasn't just about her shoes being worn out. It was about her knowing that asking for something as basic as a new pair of shoes was a burden. Knowing that money was tight, that she shouldn't ask, that she should try to make do with what she had, even if what she had was falling apart at the seams. She wasn't delaying because she liked her old shoes. She was delaying because she was embarrassed, because she was trying to protect him, to lessen the load. In that moment, Garrett didn't just see a worn-out sneaker. He saw his daughter's quiet shame, a reflection of his own struggles staring back at him. He saw the subtle sacrifices his children were already making, the silent understanding that they needed to be mindful, to be careful. It wasn't just his fear of failure anymore. It was now etched on Emily's face in the visible effort she made to hold back a simple request. His lack of financial control wasn't just affecting him and Sarah. It was spilling over, quietly, insidiously, into the present and future of his kids. He felt a sickening lurch, a sudden, blinding clarity. This wasn't just about making ends meet. This was about something fundamental, something he was failing to provide. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold wave washing over him. It was a crack, small and silent, but it ran deep, right through the foundation of everything he thought he understood. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Garrett lay beside Sarah, listening to the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing, the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The house was utterly still, but his mind was a storm. He finally slipped out of bed, the floorboards creaking softly under his bare feet, and made his way to the kitchen. The digital clock on the microwave glowed 3:17 a.m. He poured himself a glass of water, the ice clinking loudly in the oppressive quiet, and sat down at the chipped formica table. Emily's face, those shoes, they kept replaying in his mind like a broken reel. He'd always prided himself on being a good father, a responsible provider. But what kind of provider made his daughter feel like she couldn't ask for shoes without feeling like a burden? He ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble, the weight of the sleepless night pressing down on him. He looked around the kitchen, his gaze lingering on the worn countertops, the paint-chipped cabinets, the faint water stain on the ceiling he hadn't gotten around to fixing. Everything felt temporary. Like they were just renters in their own lives, borrowing time, borrowing money, borrowing a future they didn't truly own. He mentally tallied the bills again, a grim, familiar litany. Mortgage, car payment, credit card statements with their punishing interest rates, utilities, groceries, the unexpected vet bill from last month. It wasn't just the amount. It was the feeling that every dollar he earned was already spoken for before it even hit his bank account. It wasn't his money. It was debt, it was obligations. It was a constant cycle of catching up, never getting ahead. He had always told himself it wasn't his fault. The economy was bad, his factory job didn't pay enough. The cost of living kept rising. Bad luck. He'd blamed the system, blamed his employer, blamed fate. But tonight, in the merciless quiet of 3 a.m., there was nowhere left to hide. He was the common denominator. He was the one who had allowed his finances to run him instead of the other way around. He saw his own procrastination, his overwhelm, his tendency to just push problems aside because they felt too big to tackle. He saw the victim he had become, always reacting, never taking charge. A cold, hard knot formed in his stomach. What if he never broke free? What if Emily and Leo grew up and found themselves in the exact same trap, inheriting not just his genes, but his financial anxieties, his inability to get ahead? The thought was a raw, visceral punch to the gut. He saw himself, an older, more defeated version, still chasing the tail of his debt, still telling himself it wasn't his fault while his kids struggled in the background. The fear wasn't just about his own comfort anymore. It was about condemning his children to a life he desperately wanted to escape. It was brutal. It was raw. And for the first time, he admitted to himself the true depth of his fear. He was failing them. He had to change. He just didn't know how. That admission, ragged and raw, was the breaking point. It wasn't a loud declaration, no sudden lightning bolt, but a quiet, searing understanding that settled deep in his bones. He lay there still, the digital glow of the alarm clock the only witness, and whispered not to the room but to the suffocating weight on his chest. Enough! Just enough. He didn't know what he would do. He didn't have a sudden, brilliant plan to magically make the debt vanish or to conjure a fatter paycheck. All he knew was that this path, the one he'd been on for decades, was a dead end. He couldn't keep waking up every day with that cold dread, watching his kids unconsciously carry the burden of his inaction. He couldn't face another year where his primary financial activity was just trying to keep his head above the floodwaters. The thought of Emily again looking down at her scuffed shoes, stifling her request, was a hot poker to his soul. When the 5 a.m. alarm finally blared, it sounded different. Not just an unwelcome jolt to another monotonous day, but a call to arms. Garrett pushed himself up, the stiffness in his joints a familiar ache, but there was a new, unfamiliar stiffness in his resolve. He moved through his morning routine, the quick shower, the lukewarm coffee, the worn work boots with a focused intensity. Sarah stirred when he kissed her forehead, and he saw the faint, worry lines even in her sleep. Not today, he thought. Not anymore. He drove to the factory, the pre-dawn streets slick with dew, the usual soundtrack of defeat replaced by a quiet humming in his head. He punched the clock, went through the motions on the assembly line, the rhythmic clang and hiss of machinery a backdrop to his churning thoughts. All day, he turned over the word. Ownership. It wasn't just about owning the house, which the bank practically did anyway. It wasn't about owning the beat-up pickup truck. It was about owning his choices. Owning his situation. Owning every single dollar that came into his hands and every single dollar that went out. He realized how little he actually knew about where his money went. He'd glance at the bank's statement, see the dwindling balance, and just sigh, writing it off as life. But he didn't own the details. He didn't track it. He just reacted to the consequences. When he got home that evening, the usual exhaustion vied with a potent sense of purpose. Emily was doing homework at the kitchen table. Leo was absorbed in a cartoon. Sarah was stirring something on the stove. "Hey," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Rough day?" "Something like that," he mumbled, heading straight for the small, cluttered desk in the corner of their bedroom. It was usually buried under old mail, drawings from the kids, and half-finished crossword puzzles. Tonight it was the front line. He started pulling out every piece of paper that looked like a bill, a statement, an overdue notice. Credit card statements, utility bills, the car loan, the mortgage statement, medical bills from last year's flu that they were still chipping away at. He hadn't looked at most of them properly in months, just filed them into the deal with it later pile, which usually meant pay the minimum and forget about it until the next one arrives. As he spread them out, the sheer volume of paper felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. Each envelope a little accusation, each number a reminder of how deep the hole was. His hands, usually so steady from years of working a machine, trembled slightly. He felt the familiar urge to just sweep it all back into the drawer, close his eyes, and pretend it wasn't there. The overwhelm was a thick fog trying to roll in and obscure his vision. He could feel his old self, the procrastinator, the victim, trying to claw its way back. Just open one, just look at one. He picked up a credit card statement. The interest rate was a dizzying percentage. The minimum payment felt like a joke compared to the total balance. He felt a familiar knot of despair tightening in his chest. "This is impossible," a voice in his head whispered. "You can't fix this. It's too big. You're too late." But then he thought of Emily and her shoes. He thought of Leo, innocent, oblivious, but someday soon he wouldn't be. And that quiet, "enough," from 3 a.m. resurfaced. He took a deep breath, picking up a pen. This wasn't about magically making the debt disappear tonight. This was about acknowledging it, about owning it, about looking it squarely in the face. This was his mess, and he was going to start cleaning it up. He started with the oldest bill, his jaw set, a flicker of something new, something determined in his tired eyes. Garrett sat there for hours that first night. The stack of bills, which he'd previously ignored, now laid bare the ugly truth of his financial situation. Each number was a punch to the gut. The credit card with its compounding interest felt like a shark circling, always ready to take another bite. The car loan, necessary but oversized, stretched out for years. The medical bill from Leo's last ear infection, still stubbornly unpaid. He didn't just look at them, he felt them. He felt the weight of them, the collective burden of years of small evasions and convenient ignorances. His pencil scratched numbers on a yellow legal pad, trying to untangle the mess. He discovered hidden fees, realized he was paying interest on interest, found subscriptions he'd forgotten about entirely. The initial surge of determination battled with a rising tide of nausea. He wanted to push it all away, walk out to the garage, just escape. But Emily's face, pale and hesitant when she'd asked about shoes, burned behind his eyelids. He stayed. He wrote down every single debt, every single payment, every single due date until his eyes blurred and his hand cramped. It wasn't a plan, not yet. It was just an inventory, a brutal, honest accounting. He finally pushed back from the table around midnight, the kitchen light casting long shadows. He hadn't fixed anything, but he hadn't run away either. That, he thought, was a start. The next few days were a grind, not just at the factory, but at home. The usual evening routine, dinner, some TV, maybe a quick chat with Sarah, was now punctuated by Garrett retreating to the kitchen table with his stack of papers. Sarah noticed. "Everything all right, honey?" She'd ask gently, her brow furrowed. He'd just nod. "Yeah, just sorting some stuff out." He hadn't fully explained it to her yet. Part of him feared that if he spoke it aloud, it would become too real, too binding, too easy to fail publicly. He was fighting this battle in the dark, wrestling with numbers and old habits. Day 3, the old urges started to really tug at him. A flyer for a new fishing reel he'd been eyeing showed up in the mail. A fleeting thought. Just a small treat, you've been working hard. That's how it always started. A small treat, a necessary indulgence, a momentary relief. He felt the familiar pull, the quiet justification forming in his mind. But then he remembered the credit card statement, the ugly interest rate staring him down. He crumpled the flyer, a small victory, almost imperceptible. By the end of the first week, he felt like he was slogging through mud. He'd meticulously gone through bank statements, trying to find where every dollar went, and the results were depressing. Little impulse buys at the gas station, coffees on the way to work, a few too many takeout meals when Sarah was too tired to cook. Small things, individually insignificant, but collectively they formed a gaping hole in their budget. He made a rudimentary budget, cutting out the obvious fat, but it felt like trimming a whale with a butter knife. The numbers still didn't quite add up. There wasn't enough left over to make a dent in the principal of any of those huge debts. Despair gnawed at him. This is why I gave up before, he thought. It's just not enough. He found himself staring blankly at the TV one evening, the budget sheets ignored, the familiar lethargy seeping back in. He just wanted to go back to ignoring it all. He was tired, so tired. Then came the real test around day 14. The old furnace in their modest home, a relic from the previous owners, chose that moment to sputter and die. It wasn't a slow demise, it was a sudden, chilling silence. Sarah called him at work, her voice tight with worry. "Garrett, it's freezing in here." The kids are bundled in blankets. His stomach dropped. A new furnace. That was thousands. Thousands they didn't have. His first instinct was the old playbook. Call a repairman, put it on the credit card, add it to the mountain. A wave of bitter defeat washed over him. "See," the cynical voice whispered. "You try to get ahead and life just pulls you back down. It's not your fault." He almost made the call. His finger hovered over the phone, ready to dial the repair company he knew would offer easy payment plans. But then he paused. He looked at his calloused hands, hands that could fix almost anything mechanical at the factory, hands that had built Leo's treehouse, hands that had patiently repaired Emily's bike chain a dozen times. Is it really not my fault? Or am I just looking for an excuse to go back to what's easy? He pictured the endless cycle, the interest payments, the trap he was trying to break free from. He thought of Emily shivering, not just from the cold, but from the fear that he would fail them. A deep breath. He drove home from work, not straight to the furnace company, but to the hardware store, a place he usually avoided because of the tempting tools he couldn't afford. He wasn't buying a new furnace. He was buying parts. He was going to try and fix it himself. It took him all night, bundled in layers, flashlight clenched in his teeth, his fingers numb with cold and concentration. He watched YouTube videos on his phone, consulted forums, swore under his breath, and learned about thermocouple failures and pilot lights. Sarah brought him hot cocoa and watched, a quiet hope flickering in her eyes. Around 3 a.m., with a sudden whoosh and a warm glow, the furnace roared back to life. It wasn't perfect, it might not last forever, but it was working. And he hadn't gone deeper into debt. He had owned the problem, and he had found a solution, using his own two hands, his own ingenuity, and no extra money. The victory wasn't just in the warmth returning to their home. It was in the quiet assertion that he could, indeed, fix things. He could fight. And he wouldn't quit. That furnace, in its sputtering resurrection, became a beacon for Garrett. It proved something to him, not just that he could turn a wrench, but that he could own a problem, wrestle it to the ground, and come out on top without a lender's heavy hand on his shoulder. The warmth in the house wasn't just physical. It started to thaw something cold and rigid inside him. The next morning, instead of the usual dread, a quiet hum of determination resonated within him. He still dragged himself out of bed at 5, still punched the clock at the factory, but his eyes were different. They weren't just seeing the endless rows of machines, they were scanning for possibilities. That week, he looked at the sagging kitchen cabinet door, the one that had always bothered Sarah, and instead of sighing, he found his tools. A few screws, a bit of shimming, and suddenly it hung straight. Sarah caught him in the act, a small, surprised smile gracing her lips. "Looks good, honey," she'd said, and it felt like a victory bigger than any bonus. He started small, just like the story of a man eating an elephant one bite at a time. The utility bills, once just numbers he paid, became puzzles to solve. He called the internet provider, negotiated a better rate. He tracked their electricity usage, turning off lights religiously, unplugging phantom chargers. Every dollar saved was a dollar he now owned, a brick added to a wall against future financial storms. He started a spreadsheet, a simple thing on an old laptop, listing every expense, every payment. Before, looking at his money felt like looking at a stranger's ledger. Now it was his own accounting, a direct reflection of his choices. His colleagues at the factory started to notice a subtle shift. Garrett wasn't cracking jokes more often, but there was a new energy in his movements, a focus in his eyes that wasn't just about making it to quitting time. When old man Henderson complained about the rising cost of car repairs, Garrett offered a tip he'd learned fixing his own brakes. When a younger guy grumbled about his credit card debt, Garrett just listened, a quiet understanding in his gaze, but didn't offer any platitudes. He was learning still, but he was doing. Days turned into weeks. The house, while still modest, began to show the fruits of his newfound ownership. The leaky faucet in the bathroom, a perpetual drip that had driven Sarah mad, was fixed. The wobbly leg on the kitchen table was stable. These weren't grand renovations, but they were tangible improvements, small victories that added up, reflecting a man who was no longer letting things fall apart around him. He'd even started a small jar on the kitchen counter, labeling it "Emergency Fund," dropping in spare change and the occasional $5 bill he'd saved by packing his lunch instead of buying it. It was barely anything, but it was something. It was his. Sarah, his anchor through all the years of quiet despair, felt the change most profoundly. It wasn't just the fixed cabinet or the silent faucet. It was the way Garrett carried himself. The slump in his shoulders seemed to have eased. He still looked tired after a long day. The lines etched around his eyes were still there, but the weariness had a different quality now. It was the weariness of effort, not of defeat. He was present when he was home, really there with Emily and Leo, not just physically but mentally, his mind less clouded by the looming shadows of debt. One evening, Emily came to him, a slight hesitance in her voice, mentioning a school field trip that required a small fee. Garrett's heart still gave a familiar clench, a phantom pain from the old days. But then he remembered the emergency fund jar, small as it was, and the extra money he'd managed to save by fixing the car himself instead of taking it to the shop. He looked at Emily, really looked at her, and saw not a burden but an opportunity. He smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. "How much is it, sweetie?" he asked, already knowing he had it, already knowing he could make it work. He hadn't just found the money, he had found the control. He had owned the problem before it even became one. He was still Garrett, the factory worker with calloused hands and a practical mind. But he was also a new man. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, not yet, maybe never completely. But it no longer owned him. Now he owned his choices, his decisions, his money. And with that ownership, something far more valuable than cash had started to accumulate: hope. Sarah felt it too. It wasn't just the absence of late-night tension or the sight of a small, growing savings account in their ledger. It was the way Garrett looked at her, truly met her gaze when they talked about the future. Before, those conversations had been laced with unspoken dread, with the what-ifs that gnawed at his gut. Now there was a calm certainty, a quiet strength that settled in their modest living room. He started tackling those long-deferred repairs on the house, not with resignation, but with a deliberate, almost joyful purpose. The leaky faucet got fixed right, the loose floorboard finally secured. Small things, maybe, but each one a testament to reclaimed control. He wasn't just fixing a house, he was shoring up the foundations of their lives. He learned to differentiate between what he needed and what he was told he needed. He started studying his factory's benefits package more closely, understanding the nuances of his pension, the potential of his 401k. He talked to older guys at work, the ones who had weathered recessions and plant closures, not just to complain, but to learn how they'd managed to stay afloat, even thrive. He wasn't ashamed to ask questions anymore, wasn't afraid to admit he didn't know everything. He just wanted to know enough to be in charge. Emily, now with shoes that fit and no hesitation about field trip fees, noticed her dad humming old tunes while doing chores. Leo, no longer sensing the unspoken stress, would sprawl on the living room floor, drawing fantastical creatures while his dad balanced the checkbook. A quiet, reassuring presence. Garrett even started teaching them in simple terms about saving, about choices, about the power of earning and keeping. He wasn't lecturing, he was demonstrating, living the lesson in front of them every day. He remembered that conversation with his daughter, the shame in her eyes. It still pricked him, a sharp reminder. But now, when he looked at Emily, he saw a girl with her head held high, secure in the knowledge that her needs were met, her future considered. He wasn't just paying bills, he was building a legacy, piece by hard-earned piece. It wasn't about being rich in the way the TV commercials showed, but rich in security and peace of mind in the quiet dignity of providing. It ain't about how much you make, Garrett would often say to Sarah after the kids were asleep and the house was quiet. It's about what you do with what you got. For years, I just let money happen to me, felt like it wasn't mine to control. Like it was always somebody else's before it even reached my pocket. But once I decided to own every dollar, every decision, that's when things turned around. It wasn't easy, not by a long shot. Some days I wanted to throw in the towel, go back to blaming the economy, the boss, the bad luck. But then I'd see Emily or Leo or you, Sarah, and I'd remember why I started. You gotta be the boss of your own money, not the other way around. That's how you build something real for your kids. Not just for them to inherit, but for them to see, to learn, to carry forward. He wasn't a financial guru, not by any stretch. He was still Garrett, the man who clocked in and out of the factory every day, his hands still calloused, his back still tired. But he was no longer waiting for life to happen to him. He was making life happen for him, for his family. He had bought himself not a fortune, but something infinitely more valuable. The peace of knowing he was finally the owner of his own destiny. And in that quiet ownership, a kind of wealth was growing, stronger and deeper than any bank balance. A wealth of purpose, a wealth of future. And that, my friends, is a principle as old as the hills and as solid as the ground we stand on. It's the kind of ownership